Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today with Outdoors at Amazon's event, Leadership Skills in the Outdoors by Cairn Leadership. My name is April, and I'm the Marketing and Communications Chair for the Outdoors at Amazon team here in Seattle. For those of you that are unfamiliar with Outdoors at Amazon, we are a community of outdoor enthusiasts who aspire to bring Amazonians together through a love for the outdoors. Today, we are happy to host guest speaker Knight Campbell from Cairn Leadership. A little bit about Knight. He is a naval aviator turned outdoor guide and leadership coach. Now he owns and operates Cairn Leadership Strategies, where his team harnesses the power of shared outdoor adventures to develop strong leaders. And throughout today's presentation, Knight will share funny stories, he'll share tools and the science behind why we often make the worst decision when the outcome matters the most. We'll also explore human factors in avalanche terrain as you start your ski season, and we hope you can apply what you learned today to business, to life, and to future outdoor adventures. And before we get started, I wanted to draw your attention to the comment box in the broadcast window. Here we will be gathering questions for Knight through the presentation today. So please submit your questions here. And then we will move right to live Q&A at the end of the session. And without further ado, I introduce you to Knight Campbell with Cairn Leadership Strategies.
All right. Thank you so much, April. I hope everybody has an informative and fun time today. And I'm going to start out with a story. Hopefully. There we go. About 6 years ago, I got the chance to move to the nation's capital, lived there for a couple of years, and it's a beautiful part of the world, especially for people who, hate crowds, hate heat, love skiing, want to be in the mountains all the time. And so when my buddy Steve here, yes, he looks a lot like me, it's kind of creepy if you're wondering, called me and he said, hey, I'm deploying with the Navy. I've got a week of leave. Can you come out to Washington and ski with me? And I was like, heck yes. This might be my only chance this year to actually ski because it turns out Wintergreen isn't that great of a resort. So I fly out there and the weather looks a lot like this. The passes are all closed. All the places that we planned on going backcountry skiing had avalanche forecasts that look like this. And if you're not an expert, you probably still can look at that and say, that's probably not a great place to ski. So we decided to drive about 6 hours south down to, and there was a less orange dot on the avalanche forecast, and try to do a little bit of skiing around Mount Bachelor. Now, I felt pretty good about this plan because I had skied pretty much all the major volcanoes in Washington and spent a lot of time skiing in the Pacific Northwest at this point, and I felt like I could probably keep us safe. Plus, I had just finished getting certified to teach backcountry skiing for NOLS, and I'd done a couple safety courses, Area 1 and Area 2, so I felt confident that I would know what to do and keep us in good terrain. We got there, and in the 10 minutes it took us to take our split boards out of Steve's truck and get all set up, about 4 inches of snow fell on the back of his truck. Now, again, you probably don't need to be an avalanche expert to think that might not be a great thing, but I looked at Steve and this was our one chance, and we were at this little hill called Mount Tumalo, if anyone's been there, and I didn't want to be the person that said, hey, this probably isn't a good idea, maybe we should think about another plan, and he clearly didn't. So we strapped on our split boards and started up the hill. Fortunately, as we were going up, we saw this couple up ahead of us and we thought, oh, thank goodness the locals are here. We're probably going to be safe. Not really considering that they were probably looking back at us and thinking, oh, thank goodness there's some locals behind us. We'll be safe. We get to the top and it looks a lot like this. It's complete whiteout conditions. Anyone who's skied in the Pacific Northwest is familiar with these. Whipping wind, frigid cold. All we can think to do is take our skins off, throw our boards together, get ready to go. And, really we should have talked about, is this a good idea? Maybe we should reconsider, but we don't have the time, mental bandwidth to do that. We kind of shrug at each other and Steve jumps into this bowl of whiteness. I have this distinct memory of this moment when I think, oh my gosh, I can't see Steve. If he gets caught in an avalanche, I'm not going to be able to know where to dig him out. So I jump in right behind him, right on his tail and make sure I can keep visual on him. And then I realized, oh my gosh, if Steve gets caught in an avalanche, I'm going to be in the same avalanche. So this is me at that point. I had flown helicopters and led in the Navy for about 10 years, learned how to manage risk really well through that. I was teaching at REI Outdoor School, teaching rock climbing and other outdoor activities. I was a backcountry ski, mountaineering, climbing, and backpacking instructor for the National Outdoor Leadership School. I was certified to teach single pitch instructing for the American Mountain Guide Association, and I started my own business, Cairn Leadership Strategies, where we translate outdoor experiences into powerful growth, personal and professional, for leaders. So it turned out I knew a thing or two about all of these human factors. And still, here we are at the bottom of Mount Tumalo, and I'm a little bit embarrassed to say this, but we did it twice. Because as you can see, it was clearer at the bottom. On my second avalanche safety course, ARI 2, one of my mentors, the guy instructing the course, told me this story. He said, Knight, as you start going to the backcountry more, you're going to have two jars. One's going to be labeled luck and one's going to be labeled experience. And the luck jar is going to be full of marbles. And every time you go out, you're going to get a little more experience. You're going to learn some things. You're going to see some things. And you're going to take one of those marbles out of the luck jar and put it into the experience jar. And you're going to go and guide and have different experiences and learn more and more, and keep filling up that experience jar. And, in 5, 10, 15, whatever years, you're going to start feeling really like you have a lot of experience. And then one day, you're going to reach into that luck jar and realize you're shit out of luck. And that really struck me, because we think about how our skills set us up for success, especially as leaders, how we make great decisions, but there's this huge factor of luck in everything that we do, leadership, backcountry skiing. That's really important. So a couple important themes to this presentation. Experience is only valid if it matches the situation. And luck always plays a role. If we're not trying to figure out what that role is and account for it, it's going to set us up for failure in the long run. I'll put it a different way. Many of you might be familiar with Danny Kahneman. He does amazing research in behavioral economics, Nobel Prize winner. And he said intuition is only valuable when it's built on repeated, accurate patterns and immediate feedback. We don't get that in the backcountry. When we go ski a slope and it doesn't slide, it doesn't necessarily mean that we made great decisions or had a good ability. It might just mean that we were lucky. And then Annie Duke, if you haven't read her books, I highly recommend them, and I have a reading list for you all. She talks about in her book How to Decide Resulting. We often grade our decision-making ability on the results of the decision rather than the quality of the decision. So again, every time we go out and an avalanche slope doesn't slide, we say, well, we must have made good decisions, not we were lucky. So here's the thing. We have limited luck. We have to take a lot of time to build experience, and we have lots of data. And it's easy to start to lean on this. We have a lot of data. We have great decision-making tools as leaders. Out in the backcountry, we have all kinds of great tools that you learn about in Area 1 and Area 2. So does having all the data help us make great decisions? Well, I think it's unlikely. About 80% of aircraft accidents are attributed to pilot error. In our topic today, backcountry skiing accidents typically happen to people with some or a lot of experience, and less often to beginners. And for anyone here who's an enthusiast in the outdoors, you should read Accidents in North American Mountaineering, put out by American Alpine Club. A lot of those accidents involve experts who didn't put on a helmet and didn't tie knots into their ropes. Really simple things to do that result in really dramatic consequences when we don't do them. So it comes down to this. We have luck, we have experience, we have all of these great decision-making tools, but we're just human. And if you haven't seen this Mueller-Lyer illusion, I'll spoil it for you. These two lines are the same length. And I can tell you that. You can look at them, and your brain is still going to tell you, no, they're actually not. And your brain is going to make you act on that impulse. You're going to see those lines and act on the fact, I put that in quotes, that they're not the same length, even though you know they are. That's what happened to me on Tumalo. I knew these things. It wasn't a mystery to me that facets existed, that human factors existed, and that we make bad decisions. I even thought about them as I was making those bad decisions, but we still do. So with the best decision-making strategies and all the data, if we don't account for these human factors, we can still make really bad consequential decisions. Decision-making, and why I love talking about this, is one of the fundamentals of leadership. And this became crystal clear to me very early in my Navy career when I was maybe 6 months in, and I had a chief working for me who had been in the Navy for about 25 years. We had a decision come up and I said, well, Chief, what should we do? And the chief said, I don't know, sir. You're the officer. You decide. And it became really clear to me that at that point, it was my job to decide. And often when you have the most flat organization and teams that all work really well together, when an important decision comes up that's really tough, that's when the leaders emerge. That's when everybody looks to that person and says, okay, we're out of time for consensus. We need a great leader to make the decision. So we have luck. We have great tools. We have analytics. We have data, but we need to account for this decision making, or this human factor in decision making. I want to take just a second to make the parallel really crystal clear. Skiing equals leadership. Obviously, hopefully a lot of people here love to ski, but why are we talking about leadership in the skiing realm? Well, they're both wicked learning environments. And what I mean by that is when Danny Kahneman said the experience has to match reality, they often don't. Skiing, we don't know if we're lucky or we're good. That's something that people who ski a lot always talk about. And leadership, often if you're leading out of fear or you're not doing a good job, people aren't going to tell you that. And so it's easy for you to say, oh, well, I'm a great leader. No one's telling me otherwise, when really you're not doing a good job. So they're wicked learning environments. You don't get that immediate feedback. They both require consequential decisions often. It's life or death sometimes out skiing, even if it doesn't feel like it on a powder day. Those decisions are complicated by a lot of high emotions, people who want to ski powder and have to prove how good they are in the backcountry, and a lot of people, leadership and skiing. And they're both mentally, physically, and emotionally demanding. So that's why we're talking about skiing as we're talking about leadership. Getting a little bit more into these human factors in the backcountry and avalanche terrain, this is kind of where it all started. And it's a sad story. Steve, different Steve than my Steve, was good friends with Dr. Ian McCammon. And he took a group out in a bad place on a bad day when he probably, arguably, shouldn't have been out there. And a lot of people talked a lot about how he made a bad decision to go out. And he ended up passing away and being buried in an avalanche. And Ian McCammon at the time was a little bit confused. People were saying, oh, he makes terrible decisions. He shouldn't have been out there. But Ian, just a couple weeks prior, was on a chairlift with Steve. And they were talking about, hey, we have kids now. We're going to take it easy. We're not going to take as many risks. And Ian was like, well, what happened here? So he went back and evaluated 715 avalanche incidents over a decade and looked at what were the human factors. What are the different things that humans did that led to these accidents? And he came up with what we call facets. And he talked about heuristics. Heuristics, if you're not familiar, are mental shortcuts, and they're awesome. That's how we can drive to work without having to decide which turn to take, be on autopilot. It's how we know which shoe to put on first in the morning. It's not a decision we have to make. These mental shortcuts make us faster. They allow us to get through our days smoothly. And typically, 80% of the time, 90% of the time, make a lot of sense. But what Ian found is that when they don't match reality, you get a heuristic trap. You think one thing is happening, and in reality, something else is happening. You think that the slope is totally safe. In reality, it's about to slide. So we're going to talk through these facets. There are 6 of them. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what they are, where I went wrong on Mount Tumalo, how they could be good, how they might be bad, and maybe an example of where you might see this at work, and sometimes a tip on what you can do about it. The first one, the F, is familiarity. Familiarity is the individual's use of past experiences to make decisions within present situations in familiar terrain. So you're thinking, I know all about the Pacific Northwest. Apparently that applies to Mount Tumalo in conditions that I hadn't skied it in before, which in retrospect is kind of foolish. It impacts highly trained and experienced people a lot more, which makes sense because I fell to this facet, this human factor. It helps a lot. We can drive to work on autopilot. We know our team's weaknesses and strengths. We know who should do what job intuitively. We know the rules and data and different roles in our normal day-to-day job. But it can also hurt. If anyone's climbed here in San Diego, there's a place called El Cajon. It's a classic place out in the desert. I climbed it in January. I was familiar. It was pretty good. I was going back in July, and my wife was like, Knight, it's going to be hot. You better take water. You better go early. And I was like, no, I got this. A lot of people can probably relate with this, you know, listen to your spouse. And I went out and it was hot. But because I was familiar with it in a different circumstance, I didn't account for that. It can really hurt you in outdoors. It can hurt you in business and in leadership. If you have a periodic meeting, a quarterly meeting, and you're not prepared for it, you get complacent, you're familiar with it, it can really hurt when you go in there and get blindsided by a new idea. Acceptance. The tendency to engage in decisions we think will get us noticed or accepted by the people that we respect or like. So in this case, I didn't want to be the one that said we shouldn't do the thing that we said we were going to do to Steve. He didn't want to be the one to speak up either. Obviously, that's a bad situation on Mount Tumalo. But it helps a lot. It makes us masters at social cues. It allows us to build teams quickly, to bring people in, to make people feel accepted, and for us to incorporate ourselves into teams quickly. It's not necessarily a bad thing. Of course, it also can hurt. These are things like groupthink, where people don't speak up when something bad's happening. Maybe you've heard of the Abilene Paradox. The story goes like this. There are a bunch of people sitting on a porch in the middle of West Texas, and someone says, well, why don't we go to the diner in Abilene? It's an hour drive. And everybody says, oh, okay, I guess let's do that. They go to the diner, and it's a long, hot drive. It's a terrible meal. And someone finally is like, this kind of isn't great. And everybody else is like, yeah, I was thinking that too. This happens all the time in business. And let me tell you what happens when you fall suspect to this Abilene paradox. You go along with what you think is a marginal idea to get along so that you can be accepted and liked, respected in the group. But other people are probably thinking the same thing. Or if you're in the backcountry, people are thinking, this is crazy. Knight shouldn't be on this slope, but I'm not going to say anything. And then they think that you didn't know that it was a marginal idea. Maybe you don't have high standards, which I know you don't want in Amazon. It can be really bad. Commitment. So this is Mount Whitney behind my wife and I. We tried 4 times to climb this mountain. And I tell you what, on the 4th try, you can bet we were like, I don't care what risk we have to take. We're going to get to the top of this mountain. We cannot do this anymore. Commitment and consistency. After making an initial decision, it's easier to maintain consistency with that decision than reevaluate your assumptions. On Tumalo, obviously I was very committed. It was my 1 ski week. I had flown out to Washington. We had driven 6 hours down to Bend. I was quite committed, even though Mount Bachelor, which is amazing skiing, was 20 minutes away from Mount Tumalo. I could have easily readdressed the situation and gone and done something very fun and much safer. Does commitment help? Of course it does. It prevents us from giving up prematurely. It keeps us from needlessly waffling on our decisions. It makes things go much faster. But it can also really hurt. How many people have gone to a buffet and eaten way too much because they paid a lot of money for the buffet? Or gone to a movie and sat through a terrible movie because you were there and you were committed to it? It's easy to have that escalation to commitment where you keep doing the wrong thing even though it doesn't make sense anymore. Maybe it's a goal, maybe it's a business idea. You have to learn how to cut ties with things even when you're committed. Now, I like this story of it was on a Knowles expedition. It's a 30-day expedition up in Alaska. And I noticed that students would take a really long time with simple decisions, like which way to go, should we go high or low? And I was thinking, why is this taking so long? And it was because, as I talked to people and observed, they knew they would be committed to that decision. And so if they said, I want to go high, and we went high and it was a bad decision, then they thought they were going to have to suffer through going high or turn around and look terrible for making the wrong decision. And something I tell all leaders when we take people out, when I'm talking about leadership, is when you get new information, it's a new decision. It's okay to make a decision to go high, to make a business decision in one direction, get new information and say, we have new information, I'm going to remake this decision. If you don't have new information, maybe commitment is a better course of action, because people will think that you're waffling if you're always changing your mind. So look for new information and talk about it. Say, I have new information, I'm making a new decision. One thing that is important for leaders here in consistency and commitment is having the right goals. So Bruce Tremper wrote Staying Alive in Avalanche Terrain, another book I highly recommend. It's fascinating even if you don't ski, but definitely if you ski, you should read it. He talks about having the right goals. If your goal is to go ski sick lines, you're probably going to be in some pretty risky situations. If your goal is to go out and have fun and come back with better friendships, that's what he says is his goal skiing, you're probably going to make better decisions in the backcountry. Expert halo. So people tend to yield to authority, perceived expertise, or informal leadership. And that meaning older people, people with more skiing experience or better skiers, or more assertive people. And this is interesting. When a group of completely unskilled people goes out, they're safer if they don't have a leader. If they have someone that's formally or informally designated as a leader who is unskilled in making avalanche decisions, that one person will make worse decisions and take all of those people into a bad situation. I thought I knew everything. I'm sure Steve was thinking, well, Knight's got all this training. He'll probably say something if this isn't safe on Tumalo. And it let us get into a pretty bad situation. So is it bad? Not necessarily. It helps a lot to know who to go for advice, who the expert is. Like if you need to go to a doctor, go to a doctor. The thing about the expert halo is it's a halo effect. So a doctor who is an expert in medicine will be perceived as an expert in backcountry skiing. A person who's an expert in communications will be perceived as an expert in marketing. Whatever it is, we have to make sure that we look at people in the domain of their expertise, not as broad experts across the spectrum. And I talk about this every time I guide people rock climbing, because I'll tell you now, if I tied someone in wrong and they looked at it and they said, ooh, Knight, this isn't right, but they didn't say it, people won't say anything. They'll just climb on a knot, which they don't think is right because they're afraid to speak up to the expert. And so every safety brief I give rock climbing, I say, hey, if something doesn't seem right, ask the question. I'm happy to be wrong on the ground, not halfway through the climb, or I'll explain why it's right. And it's really important for you as leaders to open that window. This one is easiest to stop by naming it. Just in the beginning of whatever activity, whatever meeting, evolution, saying, hey, I'm an expert and I could be wrong and I want you to speak up if you think I'm wrong. This is a big thing in airlines. A lot of you have probably studied CRM, crew resource management. In the 80s and 90s, a lot of airline accidents were caused because the second pilot didn't feel comfortable telling the captain of the plane that he or she was doing something wrong. Like, you don't have the landing gear down. Simple things like that, they would kind of hint at it and not actually say it, and then we'd have airline crashes. So flying helicopters in the Navy, we have a NATOPS brief. Every NATOPS brief, we would identify who the pilot in command was, and often it would be me as a junior officer flying with my commanding officer who's in charge of the whole squadron. We would say explicitly in that brief, hey, I'm the commanding officer, and I want you to speak up if something doesn't seem right. Will you do that? Yes, sir, I will do that. And that kept it from happening. So think about naming this one. Anyone who skis will know this. Powder fever tracks or scarcity, the tendency to value resources or opportunities disproportionately when we think we might lose them. There are lots of interesting studies in behavioral economics of when I give you something, all of a sudden you value it more. If I said, would you pay $5 for this mug? You're like, no way. And then if I give you the mug and say, can I give you $6 for that mug? You're like, no, I got to keep the mug. So it's interesting that we value things more when we think we'll lose them. than when we think we could gain them. Does this help? Of course. That gives us a competitive advantage if we're trying to get a patent, if we're trying to beat our competitors in business. But it could also hurt us a lot if we're overcommitted to the wrong thing. If we are afraid of losing something and we don't see the other possibilities as leaders, we miss out on good opportunities. This is Potato Chip Rock in San Diego. Hasn't broken yet, and millions, well, not millions, probably thousands of people have stood on it. And so we have empirical evidence that it's not going to break until it does. So social facilitation, social proof is a tendency for confident people to take more risk when other parties are present. I felt pretty confident on Mount Tumalo. I saw another party and I said, okay, cool, we've got this. There are locals here. Nothing bad's going to happen. Really silly thing in retrospect to think. Does it help? Yeah, it tends to be right. If lots of people are going one way, it tends to be that that's the best way to go. But, and this is a really cool thing from staying alive in avalanche terrain, the best moguls are typically under ski lifts because great skiers know people are watching. So they ski them harder and the better moguls form. Me, I'm as far to the side as I can get when I'm doing moguls. So social proof definitely can hurt us. We follow like lemmings, we do the wrong thing. If you're leading a team, some tips, you know, you're going to make riskier decisions when more people are around. So if you're making a decision with your whole team around, just know that you might take on more risk. If you have a challenge, a problem that you need solved, if you send a group of people, they're probably going to take a riskier solution than if you just send one person. How do you get around this? Put yourself in the other group's shoes. I mean, imagine if I had skied up to those other people on Tumalo and said, hey, who are you? And they were like, oh, we're from Nebraska, and this is our first time skiing. That would be a totally different experience if I just asked. So challenge those assumptions, talk to people, figure out if it makes sense to follow along. This is a really cool idea that Ian McCaman has in his literature, and he talks about the formation of poor decisions. And he kind of breaks it down into these 4 categories. You can be ignorant, you just don't have the information and the experience to make a good decision. You could be reckless, kind of like I was on Mount Tumalo. You have the information and experience, but you still make the wrong decision. And then more importantly, physical and mental fatigue lead to these bad decisions. We're going to talk a little bit more about these as we go. So we were teaching at the Naval Academy, and General Sattler, who led one of the charges into Ramadi, awesome guy, if you ever get a chance to hear him speak, was talking about leadership. And we were at a battlefield, and it was 5 degrees up in Pennsylvania. And he's talking about going hood. He said, you know, I can see in a Marine's eyes when they start going hood. They start to close down. Everything that's going on around them doesn't matter anymore. They're just focused on their own pain. And I always laugh thinking about this because it was 5 degrees and we're all like putting our hoods up slowly. Like, can I put my hood up? Is this appropriate right now? I don't know. But I always think about that too, like going hood. If you're cold, you're tired, you're hungry, you're thirsty, or your team is one of those things, their capacity to make good decisions is going to be dramatically reduced. One of my wife's favorite quotes is General Patton: fatigue makes cowards of us all. It's really important to think about what your team is feeling and if they're fatigued, because you might think you're making good decisions, but you're just not. In guiding, we talk about bandwidth a lot. If I'm rock guiding and I know the route, I have a great group, they all kind of know what's going on, it's great weather, I have a ton of bandwidth. I'm joking around, I'm having fun, I'm making great decisions. When bad weather rolls in, when someone gets hurt, when someone isn't having fun, is whining a lot, and I'm trying to manage that, my mental bandwidth shrinks rapidly. And all of a sudden, I'm not making good decisions. So it's important for me to outsource those decisions or notice that, slow down, so I can make good decisions while guiding. And fear. This is a whole different subject that I could talk about forever. I love it. But Aristotle says fear is just expectation of something bad happening. So I'll leave you with this from Dee Dee Halfhill. She's a chapter in Brene Brown's book, Dare to Lead. And I interviewed her and I asked, hey, what about fear? Like, how do you manage that? And she said, well, when I feel fear, I ask myself, is this telling me something important that I should know? Or is this just a story I made up that's holding me back? And I think if you can intellectually address fear and think that in that way, like sometimes fear is telling you shouldn't ski that slope. And sometimes it's irrational and you can say, okay, well, I've noted that and I'm going to keep going. So this is a lot, and it's just the tip of the iceberg. There are so many human factors. There's some books that I'll send out that are fascinating to read, but it leaves us with the question, what do we do? Even Ian McCammon in his article says, hey, people are getting the training. They know that this stuff exists, myself included on Mount Tumalo. They're just not doing it. So we need practical solutions that are as fast and easy as heuristic traps. Otherwise, people aren't going to use these. So here are some thoughts for you and your leadership or backcountry skiing to think about getting really good at. A lot of times we think about risk management as bean counters in some room, insurance companies, things like that. But as leaders, you are risk managers. Outdoors in the backcountry, you are a risk manager. So we think about risk in the guiding realm as a hazard, something that potentially bad could happen, like rockfall, getting hit by a rock. And then we categorize that in vulnerability and exposure. So how vulnerable am I? If I get hit by a rock, how bad is it going to be? Or exposure. If I hike up the ridge line where there's no rock fall, there's no exposure. Even if it's going to be really bad if I get hit by a rock, it'll be okay because there's no exposure. And then we try to mitigate by lowering the exposure or mitigating the vulnerability by wearing a helmet, things like that. Something really interesting in staying alive in avalanche terrain is this idea of risk homeostasis. So we all have kind of a risk tolerance. Some people like risk, some people don't. And as we get more experience, more expertise in backcountry skiing and leading and whatever we're doing, we don't perceive as much risk because we're competent. There isn't as much risk. If I know how to move in the mountains, I know how to avoid rockfall, there's less risk to me, less exposure. And so I do riskier lines to keep that risk homeostasis. I keep the same level of risk. So often we'll think we're mitigating risk really well, and actually we're not. We're just mitigating it to our comfort level. Just something to think about as leaders. All right, you all probably recognize this. Leaders are right a lot. I love that. And I would challenge you to take it one step further to thinking about your thinking. Something at Cairn Leadership Strategies that we do a lot is looking into different ways of thinking, critical thinking. How well are you thinking? Are you challenging assumptions, questioning assumptions? Are you getting other points of view? This is part of your leadership principle too, I believe, which is pretty cool. Adam Grant in Think Again writes about different mindsets, the preacher, prosecutor, politician, and scientist. Are you as a leader always a scientist? Always thinking you might be wrong, you might be missing something? Because in the backcountry and in leadership, you really ought to be. Are you in touch with your intuition? Intuition can lead you in wildly wrong paths, and it can warn you of really bad things if you know which intuitions to listen to and which not to, and you understand what your intuition feels like. Are you thinking about that? Do you know systems thinking? Do you pay attention to the connections between all the different parts of a system and not just the individual nodes? Do you take time to introspect and reflect? Take time for solitude? Do you learn to understand your biases? Something Bruce Tremper talks about is his personal disaster factor. Like, what is the bias that is going to get him into trouble? Is it familiarity? Is it acceptance? And then really looking for that, noting it and talking about it. And do you understand statistics? If a slope is only going to slide 10% of the time and you go 8 times, that data isn't valid, because if you don't go 10 times, and we could get into the weeds on how many times, but if you don't go enough times, you haven't actually had enough times to statistically see a bad event. Okay, we all know good leaders. We can point out a good leader and say, yeah, he or she is a great leader. Leadership's not rocket science. Honestly, it could be a checklist. We know the things that we need to do, we just don't do them. One of the executives who came out with us said leadership is simple but not easy, and I really love that way of putting it. So be disciplined. Think about leading and making decisions in this disciplined way, and it's going to keep you safer outdoors and make you a better leader. The interesting thing Ian found is professional avalanche travel doesn't have this as much, because a guide's job is to keep their people safe. That's their goal. It's not to go ski sick lines. And so thinking of leadership, of being outdoors as a professional thing, will help keep you safer. Having a decision-making framework is really important. Having a system, something you can fall back on. And this is what ARI uses for avalanche terrain is pretty great. You'll learn it if you take your ARI courses, but just any kind of system that you create that helps you make better decisions that are less biased. So a couple tips for that: timing is everything. If you make decisions while you're emotionally charged, like once you see that powder stash, you are not going to make good decisions. I know I won't. But if you decide to decide before the powder stash, maybe in your pre-brief or before you get to that part of the trek, then you'll make a better decision. Create decision points with clear criteria, turnaround times. We all seen all the deaths on Everest because guide services blew through their turnaround times. Having black and white, if we're not at this point by now, if we're not going to ski a slope at this angle, if the snow is coming down at this rate, we're not going to go any further. Things like that are very crystal clear will keep you safer. And I love this is from Bruce Tremper again. Designate a devil's advocate. So find someone in your group and say, hey, you're always going to disagree with us. And that's just their job. And you can make it fun and funny, and they're probably going to point out things that you didn't think about because of these human factors. It is hard to communicate. Many of you probably know when you're backcountry skiing, when you're trying to go down a line, when you're on a rope team and spread out, it's hard to communicate. It's hard to communicate in business and in leadership. And so having good communication practices will also help. The key here, I think, for all of this is naming it. Like I talked about in the NATOPS brief when we said, hey, you're the expert, you're the commanding officer, but make sure that you speak up if you see anything wrong. Like just naming it. Just saying, hey, it's a powder day and we're probably going to get wild out there. Let's just all pause and make sure we're on the same page before we do. Opens up the door for people in your group to say, wait a second, like this doesn't seem safe. And that is critical to your survival. A pre-mortem is a great tool in communication. Like sit down and say, okay, this day went sideways in every way possible. What went wrong? And then you can isolate, narrow down every single thing that went wrong, and then come up with a plan to address that during your day. Much better there than while you're out on your tour. And then I really like this. I learned this in Alaska again. I would ask, hey, is everybody comfortable climbing up this frozen waterfall? And of course, everybody kind of like awkwardly looks at each other like, yeah, I am. Social acceptance, right? Super big human factor. And I asked one of the people like, hey, everybody says yes, but I don't think that's the right answer. What can I do? And this woman said, well, why don't you just give us options? So if I say, hey, would you all like to climb up this frozen waterfall or maybe hike around to the side to get to the top? Then, half the group says, well, I've never been on ice and I'd like to hike around to the side. Great, we go to the side. So give your people options instead of saying, is everybody comfortable doing this? Because typically everybody's going to say yes. Debriefs are super important in getting feedback. A culture of feedback is super important in avalanche travel and in leadership. So debriefs, we do them a lot in the military, after action reviews, all these things. We get a rap for being really good at them, but we get very complacent. We ask the same questions every time. They're kind of like, hey, is everything good? You're like, yeah, everything is good. All right, cool, I'm going home. Think of really good questions. The American Mountain Guide Association uses a question, where were we most at risk today? And what did we do or not do to mitigate that risk? I love that question because you have to identify a place where you're at risk and you got to talk about what you did or didn't do. There's no yes or no. It's a very open question. So think of a question that fits for you, your situation, either backcountry or leading, that will help get better answers, better data, help you improve for the next time. And I always say this too, as a leader, you should always ask twice. It's really hard to get honest feedback from your people. You ask like, how am I doing? Everybody typically is gonna say, yeah, you're doing great. I know you all have a backbone, disagree and commit. I love that, by the way. But even so, people don't want to tell their boss that he or she is doing a terrible job. So ask twice. I find asking twice, I've as extreme as asking a sailor like, hey, how you doing? And they're like, oh, I'm good. I'm like, really? No, how are you doing? And they're like, well, I'm thinking about killing myself. Like that's big just from asking twice. So this culture of feedback, ask people twice. How am I doing? No, really, how am I doing? Maybe even 3 times, you'll get way better feedback. Okay, last up here, a tip. As leaders, we're stewards, and we talked about the physical, mental and emotional kind of setbacks, limiting bandwidth. When people are tired, hungry, thirsty, afraid, they're not going to make as good of decisions. And as a leader, it's our job to notice it in ourselves, because I will be the first to admit this happens to me all the time. I'm hangry. I need a Snickers bar, and no one tells me that. And I'm just focused on the mission, and I start making bad decisions, and I'm not aware of it. I need to notice that, like, oh, hey, I'm hungry, or I'm tired, and have people on my team I trust to say, hey, I'm hungry and tired. I might not make great decisions. I need you to tell me, like, hey, Knight, that's a weird decision. Can we talk about it? Or notice that in your people and say, hey, I want to get to this point today, but it doesn't seem like that's going to happen, and we're going to stop here. That is a leader's duty, to manage those different human factors. So here's the thing. I mean, I was an expert and had a lot of experience, and I still made a lot of really bad choices on Mount Temelo, and I'm probably will make bad choices in the future. It is just a fact that we are only human, and these human factors impact us in lots of really strange and unsettling ways. So think about them all the time. That's the main point of this presentation. Understand that they're there, study them, and as a leader, make sure that you're accounting for them as you're making decisions. Really appreciate the time and your attention, and really excited to see what questions you all have at this point.
Oh, I was on mute. Sorry about that. Well, thank you so much, Knight. That was an awesome presentation. Loved hearing about all your stories and just making it super applicable to leadership. I sure can pull a lot from this presentation and use it anytime I need to make a decision. But let's jump into some Q&A right here that we have for you. So
Awesome.
the first question, how do you effectively deal with someone that is taking the place of a leader and you disagree with the decision or with their decision in the backcountry?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it sounds like it may be an expert halo kind of situation where someone maybe just stepped into that role and is making decisions. I think one, you have to tour with the right people. So finding the right crew of people is kind of like climbing. Like, you don't go to the climbing gym and be like, hey, who wants to go climb trad? Like, you want to make sure that they actually know how to belay you. And the same thing here. Like, if people aren't thinking about this stuff, you probably don't want to tour them. So if they're, just going out and making crazy decisions and putting people at a lot of risk and not open to talking about it, that's a huge red flag to me. I would say, like, hey, we should probably go home. That being said, if they're making decisions that are well reasoned that you just disagree with, and you have a framework, you briefed before, you said, like, hey, here are the human factors that might affect us. Here's our go, no go criteria. We talk about like green, red, yellow light terrain. So, if the conditions are considerable, you probably shouldn't be skiing too much in considerable. You're going to say, like, hey, anything over 25 degrees, 20 degrees, whatever your level is, your expertise, we're just not going to ski, period. It doesn't matter if there's a foot of fresh powder. Anything between 25 and 20, we're going to look for these things. We're going to dig a pit. We're going to make sure the layer's not there. We're going to be on the right aspect, etc. And if those things are all good, then we can ski that if we all agree to it. So, if your leader is not listening, if one person disagrees, if one person is like, hey, we shouldn't do this, and you can't reasonably talk that person into doing it, like, that's a bad dynamic for backcountry skiing. If, you talk to the leader and you say, like, hey, I'm concerned about this, and they say, well, it's yellow light terrain. We did all the tests. Everything's good. This is why I think we should ski this. And, they talk you into it. Great. That is a fantastic team. That's the kind of team I'd like to backcountry ski with. If they won't listen to you, you're like, yeah, I'm still not comfortable with that. Like, you got to find new ski partners. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I love that you brought up having that pre-checklist, making sure like, oh, we're gonna be safe if we follow these things, and having that kind of like as a core to your backbone, and to just reference that whenever a leader, or someone steps in as a leader and starts making all these crazy decisions.
Yeah.
Thank you. And jumping into another question, I know you mentioned assigning a devil's advocate. Can you kind of elaborate more about, what makes a good devil's advocate? Would you pick somebody less experienced, or would you
Hmm.
pick someone more experienced? Like, how do you go about picking a good one?
Yeah, I would think get the most disagreeable and funny person. Like it should be a funny thing. You don't want some person to be like, no, we shouldn't ski that. I'm just not comfortable. Like make it fun and funny. But if someone's saying, if you're like, okay, like this is yellow light terrain, we did all the tests, like having a person say, yeah, we did all the tests, but we could do more tests. Or, yeah, I don't know, is this the right aspect? Like just someone to question it. It's got to be funny too. It can't be like, this person's just mopey and disagreeable the whole way through. Like they're just going to point out, like, okay, I see that you did the tests. I see it's yellow light terrain. Here's why we might not ski it, because it's not exactly the same aspect as where we dug the pit, because we're 1,000 feet higher than when we did our tests, because it looks like that storm's coming in. And those are the types of things that you want as a group to notice, and you typically just don't. Everybody knows when you see good powder, you're like, okay, I see the storm coming in, but we should just ski this real quick. Like that's human nature.
Mhm. For sure. Thank you. And then jumping into another question, I know you mentioned having a debrief at the end of the trip, and you shared two different things like asking twice and to get better feedback, or asking about identifying risk and how can we mitigate risk. What are some of your favorite questions to always bring up during a debrief? Like your
Yeah.
three most go-to questions that you always want to make sure you debrief on after a ski trip.
Yeah, great question. I'll share a personal story to start off this answer. So I did my NOLS instructor course. It was a 28-day expedition in Alaska. It was awesome. I was coming straight off the military. I was hyper focused on the mission. That's what I did. That's what I knew. And I was with a bunch of outdoor educator guides, like very granola. I'm a little bit granola too now. It's cool to be granola, but it was just all feelings and touchy feely stuff and hugs. And I was super uncomfortable. And I was like, I don't know if I belong here. I don't like this. And every day we debrief, and there are like a million different variations of this: mountain, valley, stream, rosebud, thorn, good, bad, other, like what, all these different variations. But like, what's going really well? What isn't going so well? And how do we move forward? And that was the venue that I found I was comfortable saying, like, hey, this is a cool day, but I feel really uncomfortable around you people. Like, you are weird to me. And moving forward, I don't know what to do. And the response was amazing. I mean, they were like, oh my God, we didn't realize. Like, we didn't know we were alienating you. We didn't know, like, that you were feeling this way. Like, let's figure it out. We did. And now I mostly fit into that crew. So I like that. Like, what went really well? What didn't go well? What do we want to do moving forward? But I also really like that AMGA, particularly for the outdoors, when you're doing risky things like backcountry skiing, like, and to give a little more nuance, like where was I most at risk, and what did I do or not do to mitigate that risk, and where were we most at risk, and what did we do to mitigate or not mitigate that risk? Because it's a little bit different. As a guide, as the leader of the group, you're going to be taking different risks, and just pointing those out, like creating that immediate and accurate feedback is what creates experience, going back to Danny Kahneman.
For sure. And just to wrap up, one last question here. So we talked about, or we focused a lot on skiing, but are there any other outdoor sports that also focuses on human factors as well that we should think about?
Yeah, I wish. It's crazy to me. Like facets, this is a big thing in skiing. Like if you do your ARI 1 course, it's like the basic avalanche awareness and safety course. It's awesome. If you do anything backcountry, you should do it. Beacon probe shovel, do ARI 1. They talk a lot about this decision making. And even so, like I talked about, Ian McCammon said, like, look, we know this. We don't need more education. We have great education. People are still messing it up. But I think about like rock climbing and all these other really high consequence outdoor sports and, leadership and surgery and flying aircraft. Uh, Aviation, we've got it pretty good. The Checklist Manifesto, that's not on my list of books to read, also a great list or a great book to read. But we don't do this well. We haven't really systematized human factors and thought about a decision-making framework that incorporates them. And I love, Ian McCamen's point, if we don't make it faster and easier to have a solution than the heuristic, we're always going to fall back on the heuristic because it's invisible to us.
Well, thank you so much, Knight. This was an awesome presentation, and we're so happy that you're able to join us today and share your insight on how we can use leadership skills in the outdoors. And for everyone on the call, I just want to say thank you for spending your lunch hour with us. This event is recorded and it will be posted on the Outdoors at Amazon Wiki. But it will also be available for you to watch on the Outdoors at Amazon broadcast page. So just be sure to subscribe to the Outdoors at Amazon alias and share this group with other Amazonians as well. And once again, thank you, Knight. I hope everyone has a good day.
Thank you, April. My pleasure.
Of course.